Right. So in today's session, we are going to talk about ecological successions. So what is a succession basically? See, when we talk about any of the communities that we see, whether you look at a forest, whether you look at an ocean, whether you look at any of the ecosystems that you see, you can clearly spot the difference between one community to the another community. Like if you compare the grassland community and with respect to the desert and to the tropical forest, you find a very significant difference. What difference you can find is if you look at the tropical forest, you can see that the ecosystem and the balance between the demands of energy and the supply of energy and the interdependency of these organisms on each other is very well balanced, and it tends to remain constant in almost all the conditions except for few uncertain conditions. So these are called as climax communities. So these climax communities are very stable communities. Okay, one way to understand climax communities is it's stable communities. Okay, so they are called as stable communities. So now, when we take an example of a climax community, why are we taking an example of climax community? Was it one step process where all these living organisms that were there suddenly they started understanding that okay, you supply this, I give this, and we will just interdepend on each other? That did not happen. Even the establishment of a simple food chain, a food web, a nutrient cycle, anything you take, it has taken over millions and million years of successions. So, succession talks about what is the pioneers community that was accessed by the present community. Okay, so this is called as a succession, and succession is very, very important for the ecosystem to grow and to become diverse. Okay, so what happens when it comes to the succession? As the succession passes from one community to the other community, and here the new joining communities will replace the older communities based on the changes in the environment. Sometimes before that there was more water, now it is there is no water or less water. Now it is only dry land, before it was wetland. So now the predator, the decomposer, and the prey relationships also change. The organisms change. When the organisms change, now you can see that the interaction also changes. So when the interaction changes, we know that the result that result in basically the change in the overall population gradually as it goes further. So these successive communities which have participated, okay, so they are basically called as serial stages, or it is also called as serial communities. Okay, so these communities are called as serial communities. Now, any of the succession that has happened over a period of time, that is called as a seer. Okay, so that is called as a seer. Did you understand? So now the any of the communities when we talk about their beginning either happens in land or in water. So if it has happened in land, that is called as xerarch succession, and if it happens in water, it is called as hydrarch succession. So what are we talking about? We are talking about ecological successions, or how the organisms that we see in a dense forest, the relationship or the interdependency that we see, or the exact balance that we see, right? All of it is possible. How? That is possible through succession. Okay. So what is succession? Over millions and millions of years ago, the landscape changed, the requirements changed. Okay, and vegetation changed with vegetation, species changed with species, communities changed. So this constant replacement happens, and eventually it becomes a balanced family. So this balanced family is called as a climax community. On all the stages in which the communities were replaced, it is called as the serial stages or serial communities, and these successive stages it is called as seers. Okay, so as I told you, this succession can happen in two ways, whether it is hierarch or xerarch. In both hierarch or xerarch successions, it should start at certain point, and this certain point is called as primary succession, or where it starts is called as primary succession. So what happens in primary successions? Primary succession is happens, or it happens in a place where there is no life at all at any point of time. So it is beginning at that stage. So this is called as primary succession. For example, when you have a fresh lava and the lava cool down into the rocks, and this bare rock is a starting point for the lives to start. So if the life starts on this bare rock or where there was no life at all, so this initial succession is called as primary successions. So usually the primary successors in the land is called as lichens, where they go and they attach to the exposed rocks and they start the vegetation. And gradually you can see that the vegetation keeps getting replaced. And see here, from lichens to the grass, grass to the herbs, herbs to shrubs, shrubs to young forest, young to the mature forest, mature to the climax forest. So this successive stages, it is called as succession. Understood? If it happens in the very first time, it is called as primary succession. Now, coming to secondary succession, because of environmental disasters or the man-made disasters such as deforestation, such as forest fires, or such as loss of habitat, any of these things, any of the reasons, now already pre-existing life has been wiped out, and the remnants of this land or the area where the life was already there, there the succession happens, or there the life starts again. That is called as secondary succession. Now, the secondary succession establishes over the prior succession, that means prior community. So that is why here the growth of this new life, or the growth of the succession or the new community that comes into here, okay, from where the bare land is started with life, here the space of the growth is very very high, because secondary succession starts on the life that was erased of this planet, right, of this place, right. So this biota removed place has a lot of richness that can support life. So that is why the secondary succession, they start dominantly growing initially, okay, and then finally it leads to the re-establishment of the community, and finally it may reach to the climax community models, okay. Now, whenever in this succession takes place, so usually the prior species always get affected. Either they get replaced, either they get extinct, either they become a part of it. Okay, so the prior communities always get affected, and the prior communities have to keep on adapting to the newer communities. So that is when the succession becomes okay. Chalo. Now, what is the difference between the primary succession and a secondary succession? As I told you, primary succession happens in a lifeless area, and the secondary succession begins where the life has already been there. So this is very slow. That is very very fast. Okay, primary succession is very slow. Secondary succession is very very fast. Understood? Chalo. Now let us talk about one of the examples of a succession, that is Zerard succession. Why are we talking about only hierarch or Zerard succession? These are the only two ways in which the life might have originated. So that's where we start from. So when we talk about Zerarch, Zerarch means land succession, and you know that in the initial stages, the land was very, very rocky. Okay, 1 second. Okay, the land was very, very rocky, and there was no, sorry, there was no soil. So initially, what happens? This exposed rock, which was freshly opened into the air, it undergoes weathering. That is the climatic changes because of sunlight and rainfall and wind. Now, what happens? The integrity of the rocks becomes loose and they start turning into dust, and the dust turns into soil. Now here, these slightly exposed rocks, they which are like little bit in the weathering process, they become a very good ground for the lichens to start their life. So the lichens are the first pioneer species to start the life on bare rocks. So the lichens have a very short root system, and they secrete this powerful chemical, enzymes which can break down these rock particles. Okay, and these rock particles that are broken down by these lichens and this weathering process, they create this soil. So the soil has very much rich nutrients, and it does not have minerals. Understood? So give me a second, students. All right. So now what happens? These lichens, they release the soil, and the soil is very powerful in minerals, but they're not very rich in nutrients. So what happens? The small annual weeds, and the annual weeds will rule for some time, and it will loosen up more soil, and it will enrich the fertility. That will be replaced by perennial weeds and grasses. And perennial and weeds and grasses, they that leads to shrubs, shrubby forest. Shrubby leads to aspen, cherry, or young pine forest. And then finally, it leads to beech and maple or broadleaf forest or mature forest. Okay, so that is how the Zerat succession takes place. Okay, next next one is hydrarch succession. In hydrarch succession, we have the life starting in water. So the only source of energy in the water is sunlight. So to harvest the sunlight energy, we have our phytoplankton. So the phytoplankton harvest the energy, and they slowly start enriching the organic matter in the water. So that leads to the rich manure content or humus content or nutrient content in the bed of these lakes. So that leads to the submerged plant stage, where the submerged plants start using these nutrients and they start growing. Now, the submerged plant stage will enrich more nutrients that leads to the floating plants. Okay, floating plant stage. So, in the floating plant stage, you have a lot of vegetation of the other organisms also, which are constantly increasing the organic matter. So the lake becomes warmer, so that will become the enrichment of more and more of these organisms and their population. So finally, the water levels drop, and submerged plants, sorry, floating plants will be replaced completely. And now we have buried plants, water plants, and this is called as reed swamp or swampy plants. So the swamp will be replaced by the complete diminishing of marshy, where we have very less water and very large amount of vegetation. Marshy meadow will be eventually replaced by the land. Now here, in each of this stage, what happens is the population density keeps on growing, the species richness keeps on changing. With the species richness, it actually changes. It becomes higher and higher as it goes from one community to the other community. Okay. So now, as we move up the communities, now what is happening here, students? Now we can see that the organism population has increased, species richness has increased. Now the interaction between the species has increased. So that will lead to eventually in the formation of climax communities. Understood? Okay. So this is called as hydrarch succession. Now, next topic that we have to study is nutrient cycle, which is the last part of our chapter. So we know that nutrients are very, very important for many of the physiological processes with respect to plants as well as animals, right? So now where do we get these nutrients? Whatever the nutrients that we have has to come from our abiotic or biotic environment, correct, right? So now when we talk about abiotic environment, that is in the air and in the soil is where the nutrients are. And when we look at us, we will understand that we are getting the nutrients through plants, and the plants get the nutrients through the soil and the environment, isn't it? So that is how the cycle happens. So the plants extract the nutrients from the soil and the water and the air, and then they construct this energy source that we eat as a herbivore. Okay, and then or the herbivores are eaten by carnivores, and carnivores are eaten by other carnivores, or we all die and then we just decompose and then we give back the minerals to the soil, and again it is recycled. This constant recycling process keep on happening in our environment, and that cycle at which in which there is a constant supply and degradation, supply, utility, and degradation of these minerals. uh, on and on, it is called as a nutrient cycle. It is also called as biogeochemical cycle. Okay, very fancy name, but they've given it. Understood. So we will study two of the important cycles here, which is a carbon cycle, other one is a phosphorus cycle. Now, very easy to understand this nutrient cycle. It's not rocket science, very simple. Now we know that I told you carbon dioxide or any nutrient has to come from two sources only. One is air, other one is soil. Now, when we talk about the carbon dioxide, we know that majority of the organisms, all the organisms on this planet, are carbon-based organisms. That means our lipids, our carbohydrates, our nucleic acids, our proteins. Most of them are constructed based on our carbon. Okay. So this carbon is very, very important for 99% of the activities and the biomolecules that we have synthesized. Now, what happens is when we look at this carbon, the carbon dioxide is either in the form of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, or it is present in many of the forms in the soil and in the water. Now, what happens if you look at your oceans? The oceans are the highest carbon dioxide, or you know, or what do you tell, reservoir on the planet. It is contributing up to 71% of carbon dioxide. Okay, on the planet oceans. Okay, so now if you see a plant, okay, we have vegetation, and the plants for photosynthesis, they utilize carbon dioxide and they convert this photosynthetic process into organic material in the form of carbohydrates and proteins. Okay, sorry. And this carbohydrates and proteins eventually they create this biomass, so that will be eaten by your herbivores, and some of them they die and they degrade and they become organic carbon. Okay, and this dead organisms, a herbivore, they build the tissue and then they also die, and some of them will become the dead organism, and the waste produced by them, that is organic carbon, they become. Okay. Some of the carbon deposits, some of the animals have resulted in the formation of fossil fuels such as coal and petroleum. They're also a carbon source. Okay, so these animals decay and they also become the carbon source, right? Now, when you look at the other source of the carbon dioxide, the human activities, okay, so such as industrialization and vehicular pollution has resulted in the high concentration of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. Now, some of the carbon dioxide is also released during the process of respiration by animal respiration or plant respiration. They all result in the liberation of carbon dioxide. So now the release of carbon dioxide comes from plant respiration, animal respiration, decomposition, and then human activities, etc. Consumption takes place through photosynthesis. So that is why the carbon dioxide removal from the atmosphere is very difficult, and their increasing rates will lead to global warming and the greenhouse effect. Understood? So now these ways in which our organisms take out this carbon dioxide from the environment and then use it to another source, such as construction of carbohydrates or proteins. So they act like carbon sinks. So our ocean is a very great carbon sink, and our phytoplankton play a majority of role in removing the excessive carbon dioxide in the environment. Whereas the other contributor for this is plants and plant species, which perform photosynthesis for the removal of carbon dioxide. Some of the carbon dioxide also become unavailable for the organisms since they leach out into the lower parts of the earth through water drains, where they form sediments of salts. Okay, so this, for example, calcium carbonate. Okay, is another example. So when the sedimented, it becomes unavailable as a mineral resource or a nutrient resource for the organisms. Okay, so that is about carbon dioxide cycle. Next cycle is the phosphorus cycle. Hold on. Yeah. Next one is phosphorus cycle. Now, phosphate is very, very important, or phosphorus is very, very important for all living organisms. Why? We already know that they are the part of plasma membrane, they're the part of DNA, they're the part of RNA, they're the part of many of the organic molecules. Okay. For example, even amino acids, etc. So that is why phosphorus is very, very important for all living organisms, and it is very major. The only way these organisms can get this phosphorus is through rocks. Okay, so the rocks are very rich in phosphorus. They have to mineralize, and they have to become a nutrient in the soil, so to provide for the plants. So what happens here? The only way that we have phosphorus is through weathering of rocks. Okay, and by the phosphate carried by the water, or any geological uplift and the formation of a new rock happens. So all this process is naturally what happens when the weathering keeps happening. Now all these minerals like phosphate, they get mixed up in the soil soup or soil syrup. Now this phosphate, actually what will happen, they keep on depositing on the lands and banks of the rivers, and as it gets more and more enriched into the later terrestrial parts. Now, Some of the phosphate, they go as a phosphate reserve in the form of salts, and some of them actually they become a runoff phosphate for the farmlands. Okay, and they get back into the same leaching water. Now these plants, they take this phosphate from the water mixed soil solution, and then they absorb. So the plants fix the phosphate first, and we eat the plants and we get phosphate. Okay, and then we die, and then we get decomposed, and the decomposers actually break down all the complex organic matter into simple inorganic matter. Again, that is where the phosphate reserve is created, and some of the phosphate gets leached, and then it becomes unavailable. Okay, and some of the phosphate of the degradation is picked up by the plants. See, the cycle continues, and this is how the energy cycle ends. Okay, now coming to the last aspect of this lesson, I know that thrice I have told you about the last aspect, but this is the final. The last one is ecological services. Now, when we look at ecological services, it is a very important aspect of our ecosystems. Why? Because if you try to pay bill for everything that our nature does, such as giving you oxygen for breathe, giving of carbon dioxide, maintaining temperature, giving you rain, giving you sun, giving you energy, right? Giving you food, giving you shelter, and giving you so many different things. All the things that are essential for you to survive is provided by nature, and this we call it as services done by the nature. Now we can't pay the price for this, and if you have to pay the price, you can't put an estimate. But human mind can do anything. If you put an estimate, it comes up to $35 trillion. That is the service cost that the nature gives us every year, and our global economy cannot even afford that rates of these services provided by our ecosystems. So it is tremendous value. I mean, like, it's invaluable. So that is why it becomes a primary focus that we try to respect nature, at least in monetary terms, so that we understand the impact of nature. So nature gives so much of services that we try to protect it so that we don't pay the bills for the oxygen we breathe. Understood? So ecological services are very obvious services where you protect the nature and the nature protects you because you're benefited by the nature, right? So it's a very simple topic and it's not so elaborate to explain. Go through ecological services. Okay, there are certain terms like the economy in terms of how much it is provided. Okay, and what are the estimates? Rest of it we are done for today. But I mean the class for ecosystems is complete. Do you guys have any doubts?